Welcome to VOA's Short Opinions of this day, September 1st. I'm your host, Zhi Yuan. Middle East peace progress in stalemate once again draws attention of the world. EU Foreign Policy Chief Solana said that the timetable for resuming the peace talk is going to be released by the end of September. And at the present time, the US and the EU are asking Israel to stop its settlement plan in the West Bank area, and it's in order to push forward the peace talk. So what's the real reason for the stalemate? And the policies of the President Obama, how can it influence the U.S. and the Muslim world? And today we have an expert on international affairs to talk about this with everybody. And we welcome you to participate in our discussion later. In addition, in this hour's international news bulletin, we are going to report on Dalai Lama's holding a mass prayer mass for the people, the victims of the typhoon in Taiwan. And China has shown their discontent over the visit of Dalai Lama to Taiwan. Let's stay tuned for this hour's international news bulletin first. Okay, thank you. Dalai Lama on Tuesday held a prayer mass for the people, the victims of typhoon in Taiwan. And China has shown its dissatisfaction about the visit and already postponed some of the activities that meant to improve the bilateral relations. Dalai Lama's visit to Taiwan to pray for the victims of typhoon has already challenged the bilateral relations that have been approved cross-strait. And the KMT on Tuesday said that China has postponed some of the activities to improve the bilateral relations. And very obvious is showing the dissatisfaction of visit of Dalai Lama. And the KMT spokesperson that China has cancelled or postponed at least two of important visits of the delegations, and also the ceremony for celebrations of the direct flight of the cross-strait. And that the higher official of the KMT said that the KMT already sent an envoy to China and to seek for the understanding from Beijing. And the general director of the DPP also said that the chairman of the DPP said that China should face this issue rationally. They should consider that Dalai Lama came to Taiwan. It's time to comfort the soul of Taiwanese people. If China can face this issue positively, I believe that the relationship of Taiwan and China will improve. Dalai Lama's activities in Taiwan are welcomed by the Taiwanese people, and Dalai Lama also said that his visit does not have any political agenda, but this will not prevent him from meeting with the chairman of the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen. However, the Ma Ying-jeou administration is still concerned about the visit of the Dalai Lama, and because Ma Ying-jeou administration advocates for building a closer relations with the mainland China, and China, while displaying its strong dissatisfaction, are very careful not to criticize Ma Ying-jeou, but targeting at the mayors and the magistrates who invited the Dalai Lama to Taiwan. North Korea has lifted tough restrictions on cross-border traffic with South Korea, normalizing the flow of goods and personnel to and from a joint industrial park in North. And our South Korean Unification Ministry spokeswoman says the border will open 23 times a day to traffic to and from Kaesong, up to the current 6 times. The spokeswoman says that the number of the people and vehicles allowed to cross the border at one time will no longer be restricted, and Kaesong is home to some 110 South Korean factories that employ about 40,000 North Korean workers. The opening of a cross-border traffic is one of the several recent gestures Pyongyang has recently made in the apparent bid to improve relations with Seoul. And relations between the two countries began to deteriorate early last year when conservative President Lee Myung-bol took office. Pyongyang has protested Mr. Lee's tough policies, such as linking aid to the nuclear disarmament. North Korea says it has sent a foreign ministry delegation to China as the international community continues to try to persuade the North to rejoin the six-nation nuclear disarmament talks. A brief Washington's report from the Korea state media agency says a vice minister is heading the team and is deported Tuesday for Beijing. The report did not state the purpose of the visit. North Korea quit the six-party talks earlier this year to protest the UN Security Council decision to censor his April launch of a long-range rocket. The following month, the North staged its second nuclear test, sparking an international uproar and tougher sanctions that were supported even by its ally China. After months of rising tension, North Korea recently has made a serious conciliation gestures.
And also, the situation in Myanmar is calming down, and Tuesday, refugees were returning from China back to Myanmar. Let's go more on that for our reporter's report. The number of those returning appeared to be far smaller Tuesday than on Monday, when at least 4,000 crossed back over into the Kokang region following the end of the 3 days of fighting. Only about 30 people were seen making a trip during a half-hour period at the Nansan crossing. More than 30,000 refugees streamed into China to escape the fighting, which broke out last week after hundreds of Myanmar soldiers moved into Kokang, an ethnically Chinese region in northeast Myanmar that borders China's Yunnan province. The Chinese authorities have been providing emergency food, shelter, and medical care for the refugees, and tents and shelters in the border town of Nansan and others nearby. But widespread reports say that there's been looting from those who've already returned to Kokang and uncertainty about whether it's a place to rebuild their lives for the long term. Zhang Suzhen, a Chinese citizen who ran a small business there, felt it was not worth reinvesting in the area. Chinese people don't really want to stay over there anymore. They've suffered too much of the loss. It's terrible. The relief camps which had sheltered us were terrible. The relief camps originally were very, very crowded, and yesterday they seemed kind of empty. The military conflict that broke out between the government and the insurgents aroused a lot of concern from the Chinese government, and the Chinese want to protect the interests of the Chinese there. That's our report.
2 U.S. troops were killed in several bomb attacks in southern Afghanistan Monday, ending the deadliest month for U.S. forces in Afghanistan since the Taliban-led government was ousted in 2001. At least 47 U.S. service members were killed in August. 44 were killed in the previous month. The death came the same day as the commander of the U.S. and the NATO forces in Afghanistan said the situation in the country is serious. But the 8-year awards can still be won. U.S. General Stanley McChrystal delivered his much-anticipated review of the battle against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. The general said the U.S. and his allies will need to change strategies and boost cooperation to turn around the war. McChrystal urged an expansion of Afghan security forces and the revamped counterinsurgency strategy. U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates told reporters Monday that he is looking forward to seeing the assessment. That gets that there was a lot of positive things that happened in Afghanistan with more of the U.S. coalition troops assigned to the country, but he added the higher casualties are expected. The EU foreign policy chief Solana says that is going to, by the end of September, is going to release the timetable for the peace talk between Israel and Palestine. Please stay tuned for our report. And on Monday, Solana met with Fayyad, the Prime Minister of Palestine, and held a press conference. And he says that while the UN is having a General Assembly in New York around September 23rd, they will have a proposal for the resumption of the peace talk. And also, the Solana also met with the Defense Minister of Israel and also leader of the opposition party. And he says that Solana said that on the press conference that he is preparing for the important day in the future for this region. And as at present, the U.S. and the EU are asking Israel to hold the settlement plant in West Bank in order to facilitate the peace talk. And Palestinian officials say that only when he will only participate in the peace talk only when Israel stops its settlement plan. This concludes this hour's international news bulletin.
This is Issues and Opinions on the Voice of America. Today, September 1st, and I am Zhi Yuan. The deadlocked Middle East peace process once again is on the radar screen, and the EU's highest diplomatic representative, Solana, said that in the end of September they will announce a timetable for the Middle East peace process. And right now, the U.S. and the EU are asking Israel to stop their settlements to try to move on the stalled Middle East process. So what is the reason that the Middle East process is stuck? And is Obama's attitude toward Muslim countries and Middle Eastern issues going to affect the whole process? How will it affect it? And will the U.S. and is the U.S. playing the role it should be playing? Those are the issues we'll be talking about here today in the studio with our invited guest, Mark Bruzonsky. Welcome. This is a live discussion, so our listeners and viewers can call in toll-free and participate in the program and talk about the Middle East process between the Arabs and the Israelis or other related issues. We welcome you to call in to talk with Mark Bruzonsky. We'll tell you now how to do that. To call our toll-free number, first dial 10810 or 108710. And then dial 866-837-5161. And I would just like to remind everyone that in addition to shortwave radio and satellite TV, you can also watch live streaming on our website, and also at the same time you can read our other reports and browse. Our website's www.voachinese.com. Next, let's get right into our discussion. Welcome again, Mark Bruzonsky. Today, we'll be talking about a very big topic, a broad topic. The Israel-Arab conflict has been around for a long time, and there's stopping and going as far as the progress has gone all along. But in our news, we talked about what Solana said, that in the end of September, they will be announcing a new timetable for the Middle East peace process. What do you think of it?
Okay, I'll be very direct and very succinct. Undiplomatic, I'm independent. What Solana says is of no interest to people like me. He has no credibility. The so-called peace process has been going on ad infinitum over and over and over again, with these statements repeated by UK leaders and American leaders and Israeli leaders. There are reasons the peace process goes nowhere, and I'll give two specific ones. One, we're really in a pre-war process. The peace is the cover for the pre-war process. Large amounts of arms are being rushed to Israel, including the newest, latest super bunker busting bombs that can be used against Iran. The Arabs, of course, are arming. Hezbollah has now 40,000 missiles, nothing of the kind that the Israelis have, but at least they can shoot them at the Israelis and cause some problems. The Palestinians are totally divided. Now, why are we in this situation? And again, I'll be very direct and succinct. We're there because the Israelis have pursued a policy which has violated UN resolutions and international law more than any other country in the world. The Americans have fronted for the Israelis, have armed the Israelis, have provided the money and the cover, and have vetoed UN security resolution after resolution, preventing a real peace process from taking hold. Now, at this time, after 30 years of the peace process, or 40 years, going back to 67 actually, the Israelis have created an apartheid-type system with the Palestinians. They control the Palestinians worse than the South Africans controlled the blacks. And these discussions are usually not had in Washington because there's a very powerful lobby here, the Israeli Jewish lobby, and there are very powerful interests and corporate interests and military-industrial interests. So very rarely does this discussion actually take place in Washington. But go to the universities, go to London, go to Tel Aviv, go to Cairo, and the discussion is freewheeling and very open. So the American people don't know on the whole, and I suspect the Chinese people don't know a lot about this as well, because that's not a primary subject for them.
So it seems that right now you are very critical of the official Middle East peace process that is going on and the plan for that. But to have Middle East peace, we need a direction. We need somebody to organize it. We need somebody to coordinate it. President Obama in June in Cairo brought this up. He said to solve the Middle East peace problem, the only thing we can do is have a solution that is with the will of the peoples on both sides, having them coexist peacefully. He said Israelis and Palestinians have to coexist peacefully. So, do you think that Well, why is it that the Israelis and the Palestinians cannot sit down and talk?
Okay, well, first of all, President Obama is a gifted rhetorician and a gifted person. But let's not get lost in words, and let's not get lost in rhetoric, and let's just deal with policies. If President Obama believed his words, then he wouldn't be treating the elected representatives of the Palestinians the way he and the Israelis are treating them. In 2006, the Bush administration pushed the Palestinians to have an election. They elected primarily people from Hamas. They did not elect the people who are called the PA. What did the Israelis do? The Israelis promptly arrested 41 of the people that were elected, created a civil war between Hamas and the PA, and the Americans and the Israelis are now arming one faction of the Palestinian people against the other faction that was elected by the Palestinian people, and that's only the Palestinian people under occupation. So unfortunately, there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy and a tremendous amount of duplicity that's involved in this. And people can't be experts on everything, so most people, they hear the rhetoric, they hear the words, and they think, oh, this is the actual policy. The rhetoric and the policy are totally out of sync when it comes to America and the Middle East.
So, as you see it, looking at the Palestinians, why is it that they can't give up their violence toward the Israelis? In their constitution, from what we know, they have still not canceled the idea of wiping Israel off the face of the earth. That's still in there. Why is it that these Palestinians won't give up their weapons, won't give up violence?
Okay, well,
why won't give up that stance?
Number one, that is not the policy of the Palestinians. That is what the U.S. government says is the policies of the Palestinians. I would suggest to you, you invite Musa Abu Marzouk, the one of the heads of Hamas. I saw him in Damascus last summer. Invite him on your program. You do it by satellite. He'll tell you what their policy is. But the bottom line is, and some of your viewers may find this difficult to understand, and we don't have enough time for me to go into the background, there's no reason for the Palestinians to give up their struggle. They're entitled to their struggle. They've been occupied by a foreign country since 1967 in what are called the occupied territories. The United States has been the complicitous party in perpetuating this occupation. Their territory was divided by the United Nations in 1947 in a resolution that the United States pushed and pushed and cajoled, and General Marshall, Secretary of State Marshall, the most important foreign policy person in Washington at that time, almost resigned because he told President Truman, this is the wrong policy. This policy will create conflict in the Middle East for years to come, and I, as your Secretary of State, cannot endorse this policy. I will not endorse it. He tried to prevent the UN resolution, and Truman then said to the people around him, he said, the pressures on me from the Israeli Jewish lobby and what's happened in the Holocaust are much greater than the pressures on me from Secretary of State Marshall. So this goes back a long time. There's no reason for them to give up the struggle. They've been abused, they've been mistreated, they're the largest refugee population in the world, they've been scorned, they've been lied about, and here in Washington, when we discuss those issues, most of our think tanks and institutions won't even call on legitimate Palestinian spokesmen. Instead, we call on the PA people who are paid for and endorsed by our own government.
When we talk about the history, back in 1947, the UN resolution, that Israel was founded in 1948, and why wouldn't the Palestine to recognize Israel is not violate the resolution of UN?
If you want to talk about who's violated more resolutions, I'm afraid the Israelis are going to get that award. They're going to get the Nobel Prize for violating UN resolutions. Of course, it's complicated. We can't deal with it in a few minutes. But the bottom line of it is that people at that time knew that there were competing historical forces. I'm Jewish. Most of my family perished in the Holocaust. We never found them again after World War II. The Israeli people, the Jewish people at the time, what were we going to do with the refugees? We had a huge refugee moral historical problem. Our country, by the way, wasn't letting in the refugees. There was something about the Exodus ship and other things. At that time, the State of Israel came into being. Many people knew it would cause a conflict. That's when the catastrophe, they call it the catastrophe, happened to the Palestinian people, when 750,000 Palestinian refugees had to flee their country. That was the start of the refugee problem. The peace process has been going on ever since, but every time the Americans and the Brits push a certain kind of peace process, it ends up causing more war, more conflict, more hatred, more divisions. Someone like myself, forget my nationality and forget my religious upbringing. I'm a person, planet Earth, and I'd like to see peace in the Middle East, peace in our world, and we have a lot of problems from the environment and other things that we better start working on, or we're all going to be in trouble. But I favor not only Palestinian rights and a solution to the Palestinian refugee problem, but I'm tremendously opposed to the apartheid policies the Israelis have perpetrated. For instance, you may not know this. If you're a Palestinian, you have to use a certain small road. If you're an Israeli, you can use the super road. If you're a Palestinian, you can't go to Jerusalem and have dinner and visit me when I come to visit. If you're an Israeli, of course, you can go anywhere you want. The Palestinians have been terribly mistreated, and unfortunately my government, the government of the United States, is the complicitous party in facilitating the Israelis having been able to do this. And now we're in the mess we're in.
Well, this issue is very complicated, and also the background is very complicated as well. So it's never ending, which we talk about this issue. So now when we talk about the peace process, and let's look at the relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world. After President Obama took office, and he immediately tried to improve the U.S.'s image in the Muslim world. And then in Cairo, in the beginning of the month, that he spoke to the people in Cairo, and then he says that after decades of suspicions, now people are started talking and in a very frankly, very honest way of talking. And he says that I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the U.S. and the Muslims around the world, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect. That is that our countries, we do not have to compete with each other. Okay, now we have heard the quote that what he said in the speech in Cairo back in June. He says that he is going to start a new beginning between the U.S. and the Muslim world. He says that in the past, the American government's relations with the Muslim world after the September 11th, we can see that there is some misconception and also misunderstanding of the U.S.'s image, and it distorted the U.S. images in the Muslim world and has some negative impact as well. And Obama administration, after it released its policies, do you think the U.S.'s image has been improved in the Muslim world?
That's a really softball question. How could you not improve the U.S. image after what we went through with the previous administration? Of course it's improved, but so what? The policies have not really changed very much. Even the top Pentagon person, Admiral Mullins, even he has publicly said, we're not really doing a very good job in improving our relations with the Muslim world. And why aren't we? Because our policies are what they really look at, not just the occasional rhetoric. But there's something more and very precise that I'd like to say about the Obama administration. My suspicion is people in China don't know very much about this. Obama himself is a personality with a background, and he's very gifted rhetorically. But who are the people who run White House Middle East policy? Number one, they're the same people from the past, the same people that Clinton had when the last Democratic president was there. And number two, they are both high-ranking Zionist Jewish personalities, long connected to the Israeli Jewish lobby. The chief of staff, Raham Emanuel, actually was an Israeli and served in the Israeli army, even though he now denies it. There's a little controversy about that. He's the chief of staff of the White House. And why is he chief of staff? Because on the day that Obama, during the campaign, went to give his speech to the Israeli Jewish lobby, Raham took him to meet the board of directors, and a deal was made. We weren't there. We don't know exactly what was said, but we can imagine based on our experiences here in Washington. The man who day-to-day coordinates Middle East policy is a man by the name of Dennis Ross. Who is Dennis Ross? He's a Zionist operative who worked for the Israeli Jewish lobby for many, many years. And then every time there's a Democratic administration, part of the deal is he gets brought back into government to work on Middle East policy. So the major personalities are the same. The major forces are the same. The president is different, and he speaks a different language. But until he changes the policies, I'm afraid people like me are not going to be very impressed.
Now we have some callers is already on the line to ask questions. Let's take their phone calls. Now you are listening to watching VOA's Issues Opinions broadcast from Washington DC. I'm your host, Chi Yuan. In the studio today, we are talking about Israel and Palestine peace process and and also the relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world. And the studio with us is an expert on this issue, Mr. Mark Bruzonsky, and you can call in to ask or ask your questions or share your views with us. And this is how you can join us. Your VOA's toll-free number, press dial 10810 or dial 108710 after prompt 866-837-5161.
再拨866-837-5161。
All right, before we take any phone call, once again, I wanted to remind you that in addition to listening to our program via shortwave and watch a program on TV, you can also go onto our website and to watch our program online and also to view the latest news and video clips. Our website is www.voachinese.com. All right, next, let's have Mr. Nong. He's a TV viewer from Hainan. Mr. Nong, hello. Hello to the host. First of all, I would say that I agree with what your guest said. But there's one thing I want to say is that he said that the Chinese people should understand the relations between U.S. people and American people and Palestine. But I would say that that the U.S.'s culture is very different from that of Muslims, and I think that through your guest today that we can understand of the situation. And that's what I think. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Long from Hainan. Okay, next caller, Mr. Sun from Heilongjiang. Mr. Sun, hello. Hello to the host, hello to the guest. I think I would like to say this. If you look at the map, like look at the Middle East, is strategically important. And that is actually it's very important when you look at all of the traffic and everything around that area. And also 30% to 40% of the oil reserve are in this area as well. So that's why this area is very important. And the U.S. is a powerful country, has for many times tried to push forward the peace talk. But the U.S. has already taken sides with Israel and tried to attack the Palestine. As long as that is in the interest of the U.S., the U.S. has to engage itself. And also in this region, there are a lot of factions as well because of religions. I really don't understand that. I would like to ask the guest is that, do you think the policy of Obama administration can push forward the peace talk? What's the prospect of the peace talk? Another thing is that what's the significance of President Obama to playing the Middle East card? Okay, thank you very much. Both callers have already shared their views and also asked some questions, especially some of the questions shared by Mr. Sun. Could you briefly answer his question?
Yes, very good questions. The Middle East, of course, is very strategic, largely because of the oil reserves. And that's a major issue for China at this moment. China has emerged onto the world stage. Iran is the largest oil supplier to China at this point. Much of the oil comes through the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. One wonders when China will diplomatically and politically start living up to its weight and its responsibilities at the UN and start playing a role on the world stage when it comes to the Middle East. Now, what I said about what's called the peace process, you see, I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, we are in a pre-war process. Part of the way you prepare for war in the modern world with international communications and instant media is you prepare yourself politically. You prepare yourself in terms of public relations. You make the world believe that you've been pursuing peace. You make the world believe that you're the right party, that you're trying to do the right thing. In reality, what's really happening behind the scenes is the region is arming ferociously. The Pentagon is rushing into production a new generation of super buster bunking bombs that the Israeli wants, new generations of fighter aircraft and tankers. Large amounts of military equipment are being poured into Israel at this time. Hezbollah in Lebanon is arming in a minor way compared to the Israelis, but still a way that can cause difficulty in the region. The Palestinians are arming. Hamas is arming against Fatah, which is being armed by the United States. The Syrians aren't quite sure what to do, but they're also trying to arm and buy weapons from the Russians. And the Iranians, of course, are in a position of saying to the world, number one, we're within our rights. We have signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Israelis have not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are the ones that have huge amounts of arms and missiles and submarines and tactical as well as strategic nuclear weapons. We are the ones protecting ourselves. And by the way, the Iranians would be saying, look at our part of the world. The Americans have armies on all sides of us. They have armies in Iraq. They have armies in Kuwait. They have armies in other areas, including Pakistan, not directly, that's where the CIA is mostly involved, and Afghanistan. So do not get seduced by all the talk about peace process when in fact we all should be preparing for war, and I wonder what the Chinese leadership is going to do if we wake up one day and their largest oil supplier in the Straits of Hormuz have been closed because of Israeli-American policies.
We were talking just now about Iran and their pre-war preparations for war, etc., etc. Obama has said that he's talked about their aspirations for developing nuclear weapons. What do you think about what he says about their ambitions for developing nuclear weapons?
I think we'd all be better off, and the people of the Middle East would be better off, and the Israelis would be better off if the Middle East became an area free of weapons of mass destruction. And that's what we should really be pushing for, and that's what the real American policy should be. But how can you pursue that policy when the Israelis have huge amounts of weapons of mass destruction, when they have submarines that the Germans have provided them, when they have ballistic missiles that the Americans have helped provide them, when they have fighter aircraft? The Israeli military forces are 8 times stronger than the combined forces of all the Arab countries in the Arab League. So let's get real and honest about this. Let's stop deceiving ourselves. Who started the arms race in the area? Now, do the Israelis have a security problem? They sure do. It started back in 1947 when they partitioned the territory of Palestine, where lots of Palestinian Arabs and Christians lived, and created a Jewish state. Now, we know why it happened. And I told you about General Marshall and the controversy right here in Washington. Okay, it happened. I, being Jewish, I am glad there is a Jewish state because of what happened in the Holocaust, because of what happened to our own refugees. But for us, me as a Jewish person and an American, to treat Palestinians with such disdain, with such apartheid attitudes, and to have allowed the refugee crisis to go on for all these years, just go to the Middle East, from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan to the occupied territories. You have refugee camps where people who fled the wars in 48 and 67 are, and where they were promised the right of return. They're not asking for anything other than what the international community passed in 47, 48, and 49. They're asking for their rights. They deserve their rights, and they've been abused and terribly mistreated. And my government, right here in Washington, as I've said before, is the complicitous party. We have tremendous responsibility for what's happened.
I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask, but first let's see what some of our callers have to say. Mr. Song from Heilongjiang, hello to both of you. As for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's so complex. I personally think that the United States is too involved. After war, and Israel taking over some of their land, occupying some of their land, then the United States, for their own interests, has been doing things which have made it worse. I personally think, first of all, that Israel should get out of the occupied lands, and the Americans should not let Israel do that. If a war breaks out, I don't even want to talk about the consequences. It seems to me that the Israelis are armed to the teeth right now, and the Iranians right now are trying to develop nuclear weapons. So it's so complicated. It involves religion, it involves big countries, great powers, and their interests, and it's hard to say what actually is the best for peace in the Middle East. But I don't know what to say, but war is unavoidable. So I don't know what the expert in the studio thinks. Do you agree with me? Thank you, Mr. Song from Heilongjiang. Let's take a call from Mr. Zhang, also from Heilongjiang. Hi, Mr. Zhang. Hi, both of you. I'll talk about the conflict. Talking about Arafat, he had his ideas. Israel, we know, is a very developed country. And they're very close with the United States. But I don't know what Obama will be able to do in trying to have better relations with Muslim countries. I'm not sure. Thank you, Mr. Zhang from Heilongjiang. Those two gentlemen both are from the province of Heilongjiang. Mr. Song was really more talking about war and that it's unavoidable. And Mr. Zhang was talking more about Arafat and that his passing as a Palestinian leader affected the process. And you were also talking about how strong the Israeli military is. What do you have to say to both or either of their questions or comments?
Well, again, time's very short, so I'll be very direct. Arafat didn't pass. Arafat was assassinated. It's not discussed here in Washington because we were complicitous in that assassination. We should have a whole program about it, and I'd give you the details and the facts, and I believe I could make my case and that people would believe what he just said is true. Very little in world affairs is inevitable. We're on the path of war. We're on the path of greater conflict. I think it could tremendously harm China if, in fact, the region's resources are cut off for a period of time. But it's not really about the short term, it's about the longer term. Why do the Americans pursue these policies? Why do the Israelis pursue these policies? We pursue these policies because we want to control the region. We want to dominate the region. We want to dominate its politics. We want to dominate where the oil goes. We want to dominate what weapons are bought from what country. The Americans feel they're entitled to dominate the region like the Brits dominated the region before World War II. This is a big question for China. Is China prepared to step forward on the world stage and say, you Americans haven't done a very good job in the Middle East. The Middle East is very strategic to us as well as to you. Let's get back to the Security Council. Let's get back to honest negotiations. You have set up something called the Quartet, which pushed the Security Council out of all these affairs. And we in China's a very dignified country, so they would use diplomatic language, we're not very pleased with being pushed out of everything, with the Security Council being pushed out of everything. I'd love to see the Chinese, or at least some intellectual over there, say the Quartet should be the Quintet. We Chinese want to be involved too. You pushed us out. It's you, the Brits, the Russians, and the UN as the last party. Well, China needs to be included in everything now that takes place that affects our country and that affects the world.
Yes. And you, in talking about the Iranian issue, have mentioned China several times. So is it that you believe that the problems between the United States and Iran are helpful to China, in that when the two of them are fighting, China is going to end up getting something good out of it while Iran and America are busy fighting?
You could make a case, and political scientists sometimes do, that why do the Russians and the Chinese let the Americans keep stepping in the mud and causing hatred and derision in the Middle East? You could make a case that they think the Americans are shooting themselves in the foot so often that in the end this will be good for Russian interests and for Chinese interests. It's not the case I make. I think we need a multipolar world. I think the United States has shown in some areas good leadership, but in many areas, especially the Middle East peace process, very bad leadership. The situation is extraordinarily dangerous. If Israel and or America, and it can't be done without America one way or another. Obama can pretend he wasn't involved, but of course we're involved. If the Israelis and the Americans attack Iran, it's going to set the region on fire for another generation. Militarily, we have overwhelming force. But politically, strategically, morally, we are in great danger. And that's why Americans like myself, we opposed the invasion of Iraq because we didn't believe what our country told us. We're opposing what's happening in Afghanistan, which we think is another Vietnam for the Americans, and we think what's happening in the Middle East is a pre-war process. And so people like me are speaking up saying, let's not get seduced by the peace process rhetoric, let's get on with solving the issues, which means changing Israeli and American policies. That's the biggest problem.
That we just talked about that China's role on the Middle East region, and also what kind of interest is that to the China. And we know that in 60s and 70s that China did not recognize Israel, and later on China finally recognized that Israel as a country. It's as a policy change over China. What does that explain? What does that tell us?
Well, that's a little before my time, the 60s and the 70s, and China is not my area of expertise. But that was a Cold War period. That was a period of conflict between our countries. We never went to war, but we were, the Korean War, we got close, unfortunately. China's policy evolved. The 67 war had a major influence in how the region developed. But since I'm not really qualified to speak about that period of Chinese policy, I'm much more focused on what should be happening now. And some of us who are Americans, some of us who are citizens of the world, we'd like to see, as I said, a multipolar world. It's time for the UN to have teeth. It's time, when resolutions are violated, that they be consistently applied, whether it's Israel violating them or Iraq violating them or somebody else violating them. Unfortunately, the hypocrisy has gotten so great that we've all gotten used to the idea that Israel is treated with a different standard that everybody else is treated with. It not only is bad for the world community, it's bad for Israel. I could give you the name of Israeli after Israeli who are speaking up much louder than I am, saying our country's policies are crazy. This is going to lead to terrible destruction in the future. It might even lead to Israel's oblivion in the future. So I'm hardly the only voice speaking up. But unfortunately in Washington, these are not the voices you'll hear, and we could do a whole program on why don't you hear these voices, and there are reasons for it.
That in the program, one of our callers talked about Arafat, and he said Arafat did not die of a natural cause. But you said that he did not die of a natural cause; he was assassinated. But that was only by you, right? Only you saying that.
Oh no, my goodness! Have a program about this. I'll bring you people from. I'll bring you his personal doctor, who will tell you what he thinks happened. I'll bring you lots of people who were there in Ramallah at the time that it happened. The Israelis assassinated the head of Hamas a few years later. They did that with a bomb from the sky. He was a paraplegic coming out of a mosque, and they just killed him. He was the founder of Hamas. And then the Israelis imprisoned Arafat in his Ramallah compound because he wouldn't do what they wanted him to do. They brought him to Camp David thinking they would get him to sign on the dotted line, just like they got Sadat to sign at Camp David. And as a young journalist, I played a role with Sadat. I went, I met with him, my picture was on the front page of all the papers. I urged him to go to Israel, and I played a role in changing the history of the region, because there he went. A week after I met with him, 5 days later, he announced he's coming to Israel, and I was there. It was an unbelievable experience. But then he was tricked at Camp David. He was tricked into what the Americans got him to sign. Then he was assassinated. Then this whole process escalated. And Arafat, if I were a lawyer in a court, I could prove to you that Yasser Arafat was assassinated, and I could tell you who to hold responsible.
Okay, because this is not a court, it's only a discussion, an interview. So we are not focusing on Arafat this time, but rather we are focusing on Middle East today. And as for the peace process, that before Arafat died, and there was Oslo Accord and all kind of agreements as well. And after that, after Arafat passed away, in Palestine, is there a person to replace Arafat as a leader, and so the person who will win over the hearts of our people? Is there any new suggestions for the peace process?
Well, it really wasn't their person who replaced Arafat. It was our person, the person we and the Israelis anointed, and we make it possible for him to fly all over the world. At the current moment, the peace process that the United States and Israel are pushing, it looks like they're not doing it in tandem. I assure you, they're doing it in tandem. The public relations is handled somewhat differently. This is not going to result in peace for the same reasons that the Oslo process didn't result in peace. And as a journalist, on the day of the Oslo process, I did the commentary live, like we're doing this program, for Canadian television. And I'm proud that on that day, my analysis was, this won't work. Here's the reasons it won't work. It's a marriage by people who think they're getting married for different reasons. We've all been asked to come here and watch this marriage take place, but it's destined for divorce and it's destined to blow up. There's lots of reasons why. As far as Arafat, they used him as long as they could. They tried to get him in 1980 at Camp David to sign the agreements. He wouldn't sign the agreements because he didn't believe they were real and going to bring peace. Then they isolated him, and then they poisoned him. But that's a different show, different time. So we'll go back to the peace process today. And even I use the word peace process when I actually don't, I have to use the lingo of the time for people to understand.
Yeah, you said that you are a Jewish person and also for the Jewish state as well. And also you are glad to see there's a Jewish state. But some of the countries denied the survivorship of Jews. But it's not inevitable that the Jews want to have a very strong military and a strong country to protect themselves?
It's inevitable that everybody wants to protect themselves. If we think the Israelis are entitled to protect themselves, why aren't the Palestinians entitled to protect themselves? Why aren't the Lebanese entitled to protect themselves? Why aren't the Iranians entitled to protect themselves? How come it's only us that get to protect ourselves and arm with super weapons? That's where the hypocrisy comes in. That's why Admiral Mullen made the speech he made. It was really amazing that, I think it was a week ago, that Admiral Mullen himself, the top Pentagon official, makes a public speech saying he didn't directly criticize Obama, but he basically said, look, it's not enough to change the rhetoric. If we expect our relations to change with the Muslim world and with the Arab world, we're going to have to change our policies. And then as a military guy, that's all he said. But that was an awful lot.
As for the Palestine to build its own state in the Arafat era, Arafat has already proposed that idea. And why couldn't they build a country? What's the difficulties over there? What's the problem?
Why can't they build a country? Because they're occupied by a foreign army. In the little territory of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, there are over 500 Israeli military checkpoints. The Israelis have put 500,000 of their settlers in these territories. The Israelis have divided the territories with roads, with barriers, with checkpoints, with police. You can't go from one place to another if you're a Palestinian, but if you're a visiting American Jew like me, you're free to go anywhere you want. It's a shameful situation. Shameful. I just have to emphasize that. This is worse than apartheid was in the previous years when we all fought it so strongly. And it's almost impossible to understand unless you go there and see for yourself. Now, I've been there 100 times since my years in grad school. So, I've seen it evolve. It's leading us to disaster, and that's why I speak out as loudly as I do.
We have about 30 seconds left. Last question. Do you think that Israel should stop expanding the settlements? And if they stop, what should be the future for those settlers?
That's not sufficient. The settlements have to be reversed. The apartheid rules have to be changed. The whole the Israelis have already done things in the last 20 or 30 years that have to be reversed, not just stopped.
Okay. In the interest of time, that is it for the main discussion in the studio tonight, but we'd like to thank Mark Bruzonsky, international affairs expert, for talking with us about these issues today. The opinions he expressed and the opinions of the callers do not represent the views of the Voice of America. They're their own opinions. And our China branch welcomes all of you to log on to our website or send us emails to tell us what you're thinking. Here's how to do that. Our China branch website is www.voachinese.com. And our China branch can be reached by email at chinese@voanews.com. This is the Voice of America's Mandarin reporting. The situation in the world is changing fast every day, and we will be reporting 24/7 on the internet, TV, and radio. We'll be reporting about everything that's going on. It's objective, reliable, and factual. Keep it locked to our radio, TV, and website. Okay. After talking this hour about the Middle East peace process, let's take a look at the how